Harrison Keefe looked directly at Bruno Mars and asked, "Bruno, did Jessica Caban ever know the real reason you walked away?" Bruno's expression changed instantly. The small smile he had been wearing disappeared, and for several seconds he said nothing. Harrison noticed it and leaned slightly forward. "That question hit harder than I expected," he said quietly. Bruno looked down at his hands, took a slow breath, and rubbed his thumb against his palm. "Yeah," he finally whispered. "It did." Harrison waited, giving him a moment. "So there was a reason," Bruno nodded, but he still wouldn't look up. "There was more than one reason." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "Then why have you never talked about it?" Bruno gave a nervous laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Because sometimes telling the truth doesn't make things better." Harrison paused. "Did Jessica know what was really happening?" Bruno looked toward him again, and this time his eyes were visibly wet. "I thought she did." Harrison caught the hesitation immediately. "You thought she did," Bruno swallowed. "That's the part I got wrong." The studio suddenly felt different. Harrison lowered his voice. "What did you never tell her?" Bruno opened his mouth, then stopped. He looked away from the camera, took another deep breath, and quietly said, "There was one conversation I promised myself I would never repeat." Harrison stayed silent. Bruno's hands tightened around each other as if he were trying to decide whether breaking that promise was worth it. Then he looked directly at Harrison and added, "And you're the first person who's ever asked me the question that makes me think I should." But Bruno still hadn't explained what that conversation was, or why it changed everything. The camera was still rolling when Harrison Keefe looked at Bruno Mars again. Neither man rushed to fill the silence. The question from moments earlier was still hanging between them. Harrison finally leaned forward. "Let's go back to that conversation," he said. Bruno nodded slowly. "Okay. What happened?" Bruno looked toward the floor, then back at Harrison. "I said something I thought would protect her." Harrison frowned. "Protect Jessica?" Bruno nodded. "From me, from the pressure, from everything happening around us." Harrison studied his face. "But that wasn't the whole reason." Bruno's eyes shifted toward the camera for a second before returning to Harrison. "No." Harrison waited. "Then what was it?" Bruno exhaled. "I was afraid." The answer was so simple that Harrison almost missed its weight. "Afraid of what?" Bruno gave a faint smile. "Losing control of my own life." Harrison didn't interrupt. Bruno continued, "When people see you on stage, they think you have everything figured out. You smile, you perform, you make jokes, you go home." He paused. "But sometimes you go home and realize you don't know what you're supposed to say to the person waiting for you." Harrison nodded slowly. "Was that what happened with Jessica?" Bruno didn't answer immediately. He pressed his lips together and looked toward the studio floor. "There were things I couldn't explain." Harrison caught the hesitation. "Couldn't explain or wouldn't?" Bruno looked up. For the first time, his expression carried a hint of frustration. "Wouldn't." Harrison let the word sit. "Why?" Bruno leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. "Because if I said everything I was thinking, I knew it would hurt her." Harrison lowered his voice. "And staying silent didn't." Bruno opened his eyes. He stared at Harrison for several seconds. "No," he said quietly. "It hurt her differently." Harrison didn't move. Bruno's voice became softer. "That's something I still regret." Harrison glanced briefly toward the monitor showing Bruno's face. Then he asked, "So when you walked away, you weren't simply ending something?" Bruno shook his head. "No, you were hiding something." Bruno hesitated. "I was carrying something." Harrison leaned closer. "What?" Bruno took another breath. His answer came almost as a whisper. "A decision I made before Jessica ever knew there was a decision to make." Harrison's expression changed. "What decision?" Bruno looked directly at him, but this time he didn't answer. The silence returned, heavier than before, and Harrison realized that the story Bruno had been protecting was much bigger than a breakup. Harrison Keefe didn't move on to another topic. He watched Bruno Mars carefully, waiting for him to decide whether he wanted to continue. "You said you were afraid," Harrison began. "Have you always been afraid of losing people?" Bruno gave a small smile. "Probably more than I admit." "Even when you're successful, especially then." Harrison tilted his head. "Why?" Bruno looked toward the floor. "Because success makes people think you're strong all the time." Harrison nodded. "But you're not." Bruno laughed quietly. "No, I'm human." For a moment the tension eased. Then Harrison asked, "What scares you most about being honest?" Bruno's smile disappeared. Hurting someone who trusted me. Harrison let the silence breathe. Did that happen with Jessica? Bruno rubbed his hands together. I think I hurt her without meaning to. By leaving. By not explaining. Harrison leaned back. Why couldn't you explain? Bruno stared at the microphone in front of him. Because I didn't understand myself yet. Harrison's expression softened. What didn't you understand? Bruno took a slow breath. What I wanted, what I needed, and what I was willing to sacrifice. Harrison nodded. You were successful but unhappy. Bruno thought for a moment. I wouldn't say unhappy. He paused. I was exhausted. Harrison noticed the distinction. Exhausted from work. Bruno shook his head. From pretending everything was fine. That answer changed the mood again. Harrison lowered his voice. Who were you pretending for? Bruno looked directly at him. Everyone. Including Jessica? Bruno hesitated. Yes. Harrison didn't immediately respond. Bruno continued before he could ask another question. I didn't want her to see how lost I felt. Why? Because I thought she deserved someone who knew exactly where he was going. Harrison leaned forward. And you didn't? Bruno shook his head. Not then. Harrison glanced at Bruno's hands. They had stopped moving. Did she ever ask you what was wrong? Many times. And what did you say? Bruno gave a quiet, almost embarrassed laugh. I said I was tired. Harrison smiled faintly. That's it. That's what I told her. But that wasn't true. Bruno looked up. It was true, it just wasn't the whole truth. Harrison paused. So you kept protecting her from something she had a right to know. Bruno nodded. Yes. And you convinced yourself that was love. Bruno's eyes became glassy. He looked away. At the time, I thought it was. Harrison waited. Bruno swallowed and added, now I understand that sometimes silence isn't protection. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a better name. Harrison sat back, clearly affected by the answer, but he wasn't finished. He looked at Bruno and asked, then why does Jessica's name still make you react like this? Bruno's face tightened. He took a deep breath and looked straight ahead. Because she was closer to the truth than I ever realized. Harrison immediately noticed the change. What truth? Bruno opened his mouth, then stopped. That's the part I've never told anyone. And for the first time that night, Harrison understood that Bruno wasn't avoiding the question because he didn't want to answer it. He was avoiding it because he was afraid of what would happen if he did. Harrison Keefe looked at Bruno Mars for several seconds before speaking again. You keep saying Jessica was closer to the truth than you realized. Bruno nodded once. She was. Harrison leaned forward. So let's talk about her. Bruno's shoulders tightened. It was subtle, but Harrison saw it immediately. Jessica again, Bruno said with a nervous smile. You knew we'd get here. I knew, Bruno replied. I just didn't know when. Harrison lowered his voice. When you hear her name now, what do you feel first? Bruno stared at the floor. Regret. Harrison waited. Anything else? Bruno's fingers moved restlessly against the arm of the chair. Gratitude. Harrison looked surprised. Gratitude, Bruno nodded. She knew me before I became the person everyone thought they knew. Harrison studied him. And that's why this is difficult. Bruno smiled faintly. That's part of it. What's the other part? Bruno didn't answer. Harrison gave him a few seconds. Did you love her? Bruno looked up. The question was simple, but his reaction wasn't. He breathed in slowly and held it. Yes, he said. In my own way. Harrison nodded. That's not exactly a romantic answer. Bruno gave a quiet laugh. Because life isn't always romantic. Harrison smiled briefly, then returned to the subject. If you loved her, why did you leave without telling her everything? Bruno's expression hardened. Because I believed telling her would destroy something she still believed in. What did she believe? Bruno looked directly at Harrison. That I had chosen her. Harrison paused. But you hadn't. Bruno's eyes dropped again. I wanted to. That's different. I know. The answer came quickly. Harrison noticed it. You regret that. Every time I think about it. Harrison leaned back. Did Jessica ever confront you? Bruno nodded. Once. What did she ask? Bruno looked toward the camera, then back to Harrison. She asked me why I kept making promises I couldn't keep. Harrison was silent. And what did you say? Bruno's jaw tightened. I told her I didn't know. Harrison frowned. You didn't know? Bruno shook his head. I knew, I just couldn't say it. Harrison's eyes narrowed. Why? Bruno's voice dropped. Because the real answer wasn't about her. Harrison waited. It was about you. Bruno nodded. It was about something I had decided long before that conversation. Harrison leaned closer. What decision? Bruno didn't answer. Instead, he looked down and quietly said, "There are moments in your life when you choose between being honest and being kind." Harrison asked, "And you chose kindness?" Bruno looked up, his eyes tired. "I thought I did. But now," Bruno swallowed, "now I think I chose cowardice." Harrison stayed quiet. The camera remained fixed on Bruno's face. Then Harrison noticed something strange. Bruno wasn't just emotional anymore. He looked almost relieved to finally say these words aloud. Harrison gently asked, "Was there something Jessica said that changed your decision?" Bruno's breathing slowed. His eyes met Harrison's. "Yes." "What did she say?" Bruno hesitated. "She said something that made me realize she already knew more than I thought." Harrison's expression changed. "What did she know?" Bruno looked away. The silence lasted several seconds. Then Bruno whispered, "That's where my story stops making sense." Harrison didn't blink. "Then let's start there." Harrison Keefe kept his eyes on Bruno Mars. "Let's start there," he repeated. Bruno nodded, but his expression showed that he was already regretting agreeing to continue. Harrison glanced at his notes. "Earlier you said you walked away because you were afraid of hurting Jessica." Bruno nodded. "Yes. But now you're saying she already knew something." Bruno was quiet. Harrison continued, "Those two things don't completely match." Bruno looked toward him. "I know. So which one is true?" Bruno leaned back and took a slow breath. "Both." Harrison frowned. "How?" Bruno rubbed his hands together. "Because I was afraid she would discover what I had decided, but later I realized she already suspected it." Harrison didn't let the moment pass. "What had you decided?" Bruno's eyes dropped. "I wasn't ready to say that." "You weren't ready then. Are you ready now?" Bruno gave a nervous smile. "I don't know." Harrison nodded. "Fair enough." He paused. "Then tell me what Jessica suspected." Bruno looked toward the studio monitor. His face appeared calm on the screen, but his hands told a different story. "She thought I was planning to leave everything behind." Harrison raised an eyebrow. "Your career," Bruno nodded. "My life, the version of me everyone expected." Harrison leaned forward. "Were you?" Bruno hesitated. "I was considering it." "Why?" Bruno stared at the floor. "Because I felt like I had become someone I didn't recognize." Harrison waited. Bruno continued, "Every decision was being made for a future version of me. My schedule, my work, my image, even the way I talked about my personal life." Harrison asked quietly, "And Jessica?" Bruno looked up. "She was the one person who could tell when I was pretending." "So she confronted you?" "Yes." "What did she say?" Bruno's expression softened. "She asked me, 'Are you leaving because you don't love me or because you're afraid of what comes next?'" Harrison went still. "What did you tell her?" Bruno swallowed. "I told her I didn't know." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "But you did know." Bruno nodded slowly. "I knew I was afraid." Harrison leaned back. "That's not the same answer." "No." Bruno looked down again. "It wasn't." Harrison turned one page of his notes. "You said earlier that you made a decision before Jessica knew there was a decision." Bruno nodded. "Yes. But now you're saying you were still considering it when she confronted you." Bruno's face changed. He realized exactly what Harrison had noticed. "You're right." Harrison waited. Bruno closed his eyes briefly. "I wasn't completely honest with you either." Harrison didn't react dramatically. He simply asked, "Why?" Bruno opened his eyes. "Because saying it out loud makes me realize how unfair I was." Harrison's voice softened. "Unfair to Jessica?" Bruno nodded. "And to myself." Another silence filled the studio. Harrison looked at Bruno carefully. "So what was the decision you had already made?" Bruno stared straight ahead. His lips parted, but no words came. He took a breath, then another. Finally, he looked at Harrison and said, "I had decided to tell her something that could change everything." Harrison waited. "What?" Bruno's eyes became wet again. "I was going to tell Jessica why I believed I had to disappear from her life." Harrison's expression tightened. "Disappear?" Bruno nodded. "And that reason had nothing to do with another person." Harrison leaned forward. "Then what was it?" Bruno looked down, unable to answer. For the first time, Harrison didn't ask again. He simply waited, and Bruno knew the next question would be the one he had spent years avoiding. Harrison Keefe let the silence continue before finally asking, "Bruno, what were you going to tell Jessica?" Bruno didn't answer. He stared at the floor, breathing slowly. Harrison waited a few seconds. "You don't have to answer if you're not ready." Bruno gave a faint smile. "That's the problem. I've been saying that to myself for years." Harrison leaned forward. "Then answer it now." Bruno looked at him. "You really want to know?" I think you came here because some part of you wants to tell it. Bruno looked away. Maybe. Harrison's voice remained calm. Was Jessica the reason you wanted to disappear? Bruno shook his head. No. Was your career the reason? No. Was there someone else? Bruno immediately looked up. No. Harrison noticed how quickly he answered. Then what was it? Bruno's hands tightened together. I was going through a period where I didn't trust myself anymore. Harrison paused. What does that mean? Bruno swallowed. It means I was afraid that if I stayed, I'd eventually become someone Jessica couldn't recognize. Harrison frowned. You thought leaving would protect her. I thought it would give her a chance to live without carrying my problems. Harrison shook his head slightly. Did she ask you to leave? No. Did she tell you she couldn't handle your problems? No. Then why did you make that decision for her? Bruno's eyes immediately filled with emotion. He looked down. Because I was scared. Harrison didn't soften the question. Scared of what? Bruno took a long breath. That one day she'd look at me and realize I wasn't the person she thought I was. Harrison waited. What did you think she would discover? Bruno remained silent. Harrison asked again, more gently, what were you hiding from her? Bruno's lips trembled slightly. He looked toward Harrison, then away. I was hiding how broken I felt. Harrison's expression changed. Broken? Bruno nodded. Not physically. Not in some dramatic way, I just felt empty. Harrison said nothing. Bruno continued, I could walk into a studio and write a song. I could walk onto a stage and make thousands of people smile. Then I'd go home and wonder why I couldn't feel the same happiness. Harrison lowered his voice. Did Jessica know? Bruno shook his head. Not completely. Why not? Because I was ashamed. Harrison leaned forward, ashamed of being unhappy, ashamed that I couldn't fix myself. Harrison stared at him. And you thought leaving would fix it? Bruno gave a painful smile. I thought distance would make the problem disappear. Harrison quietly replied, did it? Bruno shook his head. No, the answer came immediately. Harrison waited. Then what happened? Bruno looked toward him. Something happened after I left that changed the way I understood everything. Harrison's expression became serious. What happened? Bruno took another breath. Jessica said something to me. What? Bruno looked directly into Harrison's eyes. She told me she would have stayed if I had simply told her the truth. Harrison was silent. Bruno's voice cracked. And that's the sentence I've never been able to forget. Harrison lowered his notes. Why? Bruno wiped beneath one eye and whispered. Because I realized I hadn't protected her at all. I had only taken away her chance to choose. Harrison didn't interrupt. Bruno looked down again. And there's one more thing I never told anyone. Harrison waited. Bruno's voice became barely audible. The truth I was afraid to tell Jessica wasn't about why I wanted to leave. He paused. It was about why I came back. Harrison Keefe stared at Bruno Mars. You came back, Bruno nodded slowly. Yes. Harrison's voice became quieter. You never told me that. Bruno gave a tired smile. Because I wasn't sure I deserved to call it coming back. Harrison leaned forward. Then what was it? Bruno looked at his hands. I went back to apologize. Harrison waited. Did you see Jessica? Bruno nodded. Yes. A long silence followed. Harrison carefully asked, what happened? Bruno took a deep breath. I expected anger. I expected her to blame me. Instead, she asked me one question. What question? Bruno looked up. She asked, did you finally learn how to tell someone you're hurting? Harrison's expression softened. Bruno continued, I couldn't answer. Why? Because I hadn't. Harrison remained silent. Bruno's eyes became wet again. I had spent so much time believing that being strong meant carrying everything alone. He paused. Jessica showed me that wasn't strength. Harrison nodded slowly. What did you tell her? Bruno looked down. I told her I was sorry. Was that all? No, Bruno swallowed. I told her the real reason I had left. Harrison leaned closer. What was the real reason? Bruno finally said it. I was terrified that if she stayed beside me, she would eventually have to live inside the version of me I hated. Harrison didn't interrupt. Bruno continued, I thought leaving would give her freedom. Harrison asked, and what did she say? Bruno smiled sadly. She said, you don't get to decide what I'm strong enough to handle. Harrison's eyes widened slightly. Bruno nodded. That sentence changed me. Did you get back together? Bruno paused. That's not the ending I want people to focus on. Harrison looked at him. Why? Bruno answered quietly. Because the important part wasn't whether we stayed together. He took a breath. It was that, for the first time, I stopped trying to control what another person was allowed to know. Harrison sat back. So the secret wasn't another relationship. No, it wasn't betrayal. No, it wasn't that you stopped loving her. Bruno shook his head. No, Harrison waited. Bruno looked directly at him. The secret was that I had been fighting something inside myself and pretending it wasn't there. Harrison nodded. And Jessica knew. Bruno's eyes filled again. She knew before I was brave enough to admit it. Harrison looked down for a moment. Then he asked, "Why keep this private for so long?" Bruno answered without hesitation, "Because it wasn't my story alone." Harrison looked back at him. "Meaning?" Bruno's voice softened. "Jessica deserved privacy. Her pain wasn't something I had the right to turn into entertainment." Harrison was quiet. Bruno continued, "That's why I've never wanted to tell this story publicly." Harrison glanced toward the camera, then back at Bruno. "But tonight you're telling it." Bruno nodded. "Because you asked me something different." "What?" Bruno took a slow breath. "You didn't ask what happened to us." He paused. "You asked what I learned." Harrison's expression softened. "And what did you learn?" Bruno looked straight into the camera. "That sometimes the person you're trying hardest to protect is the person who deserves the truth most." Harrison said nothing. Bruno lowered his eyes. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Harrison asked one final question. "Is that really the whole truth?" Bruno's face changed. He looked almost afraid again. "No," he whispered. "There's still one thing I haven't told you." Harrison froze. Bruno slowly lifted his eyes. "And that's the reason I finally decided to forgive myself." Harrison Keefe didn't speak. He simply stared at Bruno Mars, trying to process what he had just heard. "Wait, what?" he finally asked. Bruno looked down. Harrison leaned forward. "You said there's another reason." Bruno nodded. "Yes." Harrison glanced toward the camera, then back at Bruno. "And you never told anyone?" Bruno shook his head. "Not like this." Harrison's voice became softer. "Why?" Bruno took a breath. "Because I was afraid people would misunderstand it." Harrison paused. "Misunderstand what?" Bruno looked directly at him. "The reason I came back." Harrison frowned. "You came back to apologize. You told her the truth. What else was there?" Bruno's fingers tightened around the edge of his chair. "I didn't come back because I suddenly became brave." Harrison waited. "I came back because I realized something." "What?" Bruno swallowed. "I had spent years believing I needed to become better before I deserved to be loved." Harrison's expression changed. "And you realized that wasn't true?" Bruno nodded slowly. "I realized I was using perfection as an excuse to keep people away." Harrison sat back. "So you were punishing yourself?" "Yes." "For what?" Bruno looked down. "For not being able to give someone everything they wanted." Harrison shook his head slightly. "But Jessica never asked you to be perfect." Bruno smiled sadly. "Exactly." Harrison let out a quiet breath. "Then why did you make her pay for something she never asked for?" Bruno's eyes immediately became wet. He looked away. "That's the question I asked myself afterward." Harrison didn't interrupt. Bruno continued, "And I didn't have a good answer." Harrison leaned closer. "Did Jessica forgive you?" Bruno paused. "I don't know if forgiveness is something you can demand from another person." Harrison nodded. "So you don't know?" "I know she understood me." Bruno looked up. "And sometimes understanding is more powerful than forgiveness." Harrison remained silent. Bruno wiped his cheek quickly, almost embarrassed by the tears. Harrison noticed but didn't comment. Instead, he asked, "Do you forgive yourself?" Bruno gave a small, uncertain smile. "Some days." Harrison's eyebrows lifted. "Only some days. Some days I remember what I did and think I should have handled everything differently." He paused. "Other days I remember that I was doing the best I could with what I understood at the time." Harrison looked at him carefully. "Which version do you believe tonight?" Bruno didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved toward the studio lights, then returned to Harrison. "Tonight," he repeated. "Tonight I think I finally understand the difference between guilt and responsibility." Harrison asked, "What's the difference?" Bruno took a slow breath. "Guilt says you are a bad person. Responsibility says you made a mistake, so learn from it." Harrison nodded slowly. "And that's why you forgave yourself?" Bruno shook his head. "Not yet." Harrison looked surprised. "Not yet." Bruno's voice became quieter. "There's still one thing I need to say out loud." Harrison waited. Bruno stared at him for several seconds. "I wasn't the only person who lost something that night." Harrison's expression tightened. "What did you lose?" Bruno looked away. "The future I thought I was supposed to have." Harrison asked gently, and what did Jessica lose? Bruno's eyes filled again. He didn't answer. Harrison waited, then asked, did she lose the chance to choose? Bruno slowly nodded. Yes, Harrison lowered his voice. Then that's the part you need to explain. Bruno took a deep breath. I know. He looked directly at Harrison, and that's exactly why I still carry this. Harrison's next question came quietly, almost reluctantly. Bruno, if you could go back to that night, would you do anything differently? Bruno closed his eyes. The answer seemed to hurt before he even spoke. Yes. Harrison waited. Bruno opened his eyes and whispered, I would stay long enough to let her choose. Harrison Keefe stayed quiet after Bruno Mars finished speaking. You would stay, he repeated. Bruno nodded. I would. Harrison looked at him carefully. But you can't go back. I know. So what changed after that? Bruno took a slow breath. I stopped trying to rewrite the past. Harrison asked, how? Bruno looked down at his hands. By accepting that I hurt someone without intending to. Harrison nodded. That's difficult. It is. Bruno paused. But there was something else Jessica taught me. Harrison waited. She told me that apologizing isn't the same as repairing. Harrison's expression tightened. What did she mean? Bruno looked directly at him. She meant that saying sorry doesn't erase what happened. Harrison nodded slowly. So what did you do? I listened. That's it? Bruno gave a faint smile. For once, yes. Harrison leaned forward. You didn't defend yourself. Bruno shook his head. No, you didn't explain. No, you just listened. I listened. Bruno's voice became softer, and I realized how much of the story I'd been telling myself had been built around my own fear. Harrison paused. What did you hear? Bruno looked away. That she hadn't needed me to save her. He swallowed. She needed me to trust her. Harrison remained silent. Bruno continued, that was the truth I couldn't understand back then. Harrison asked, did that conversation change your relationship? Bruno thought for a moment. It changed me. But what about Jessica? Bruno smiled sadly. I can't speak for her. Harrison nodded. Fair. Bruno continued, that's another lesson I learned. Sometimes you can tell your side honestly without claiming to own someone else's. Harrison looked impressed by the answer. So why tell this story now? Bruno's eyes moved toward the camera. Because I don't want people to think strength means never breaking. Harrison asked. What does strength mean to you now? Bruno looked back at him. Being honest before your fear makes the decision for you. Harrison nodded. Then he noticed Bruno's expression change again. There's still something bothering you, Harrison said. Bruno smiled faintly. You notice everything. That's my job. Bruno laughed softly. The tension eased for a moment. Then Harrison asked, when you think about Jessica now, what do you feel? Bruno took a long breath. Peace. Harrison raised an eyebrow. Really? Yes. No regret. Bruno looked down. Regret is still there. He paused, but it doesn't control me anymore. Harrison nodded. And that's the final truth. Bruno remained silent. Harrison waited. Not quite. Bruno looked at him. There's something I never told Jessica during that conversation. Harrison's face became serious again. What? Bruno's eyes filled with tears. I never told her that she was the reason I finally asked for help. Harrison froze. You never said that. Bruno shook his head. No. Why? Bruno gave a small, painful smile. Because by then I thought telling her would only reopen the wound. Harrison lowered his voice. Did she ever find out? Bruno looked toward the floor. Not from me. Harrison waited. Then how? Bruno took a deep breath. She found out much later. Harrison stared at him. And what happened? Bruno's voice cracked slightly. She sent me one message. Harrison leaned forward. What did it say? Bruno closed his eyes for a moment. She said, I'm glad you finally chose to stay. Harrison said nothing. Bruno wiped away a tear. That was the moment I understood something. Harrison asked quietly. What? Bruno looked directly at him. Sometimes the person you think you left behind is the person who helped you find your way back to yourself. Harrison remained silent. The cameras kept rolling. Bruno's breathing slowly steadied. But Harrison knew there was still one question left, the question that could turn everything Bruno had said into one final truth. Harrison Keefe looked at Bruno Mars and didn't reach for his notes. Then let me ask you something different. Bruno nodded. Okay, Harrison spoke slowly. If Jessica were sitting here right now, what would you say to her? Bruno's expression changed immediately. He looked down, then gave a small, nervous laugh. That's a dangerous question. Harrison smiled faintly. You don't have to make it perfect. Bruno took a breath. I know. The studio became completely still. Bruno looked toward the empty space beside the camera as if imagining someone there. "I would say I'm sorry." Harrison waited. "For what?" Bruno swallowed. "For deciding what you could handle without asking you." Harrison nodded. Bruno continued, "I'm sorry I confused protecting you with protecting myself." Harrison's eyes softened. Bruno looked down at his hands. "And I'm sorry I made you believe my silence meant you weren't important." Harrison quietly asked, "What did your silence mean?" Bruno looked up. "It meant you were too important." Harrison paused. Bruno's eyes filled with tears. "I was terrified that if I told you how lost I was, you'd see me differently." Harrison asked, "And if she had?" Bruno smiled sadly. "Then maybe I should have trusted her enough to let her decide." Harrison leaned back. "Do you still carry that regret?" Bruno nodded. "Yes. Every day." Bruno thought about it. "Not every day," he paused, "but certain songs bring it back." Harrison smiled slightly. "That's very Bruno." Bruno laughed through the emotion. "Yeah, unfortunately." The laughter lasted only a moment. Then Bruno became serious again. "But I don't want this story to sound like I was some victim." Harrison immediately responded, "You weren't." Bruno shook his head. "I made choices." Harrison nodded. "And you accept them." "I have to." Bruno took a slow breath. "That's the only way to grow." Harrison looked directly at him. "What did you learn about love?" Bruno was quiet for several seconds. "That love isn't deciding what another person needs." He paused. "It's trusting them enough to tell them the truth." Harrison nodded slowly. Bruno continued, "And sometimes loving someone means accepting that they may choose something you don't want." Harrison asked, "Did Jessica choose something you didn't want?" Bruno's eyes lowered. "Yes." Harrison waited. "And you respected it?" Bruno nodded. "Eventually." Harrison smiled faintly. "Eventually?" Bruno laughed softly. "I'm not going to pretend I got everything right." Harrison smiled. "Fair enough." Bruno looked toward him. "You know what the hardest part was?" Harrison shook his head. "What?" Bruno answered quietly, realizing that I couldn't fix what happened by explaining it better. Harrison waited. "Because the past doesn't need a better explanation." Bruno's voice trembled. "It needs acceptance." Harrison nodded. The two men sat quietly for several seconds. No music played. No dramatic cue interrupted the moment. Bruno simply breathed and looked down. Harrison finally asked, "Do you think you're finally at peace with it?" Bruno considered the question carefully. "I'm getting there." Harrison smiled. "That's honest." Bruno returned the smile. Then Harrison looked at him and said, "One last thing." Bruno's expression immediately became serious. "I knew you'd say that." Harrison leaned forward. "If you could send one sentence back to the version of yourself who walked away, what would you say?" Bruno stared at him for a long time. His eyes became wet again. He inhaled slowly. Then he answered, "Don't leave just because you're afraid someone might see the real you." Harrison said nothing. Bruno looked down. "Because the person who truly loves you may already have seen it." The room fell silent again. And Harrison knew there was only one question left. Harrison Keefe looked at Bruno Mars for several seconds before asking the final question. "Bruno, after everything you've told me tonight, what do you want people to understand?" Bruno didn't answer immediately. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and took one slow breath. When he opened them, there was no nervous smile left. "That we don't always lose people because we stop loving them." Harrison waited. Bruno continued, "Sometimes we lose them because we're too afraid to let them see us clearly." Harrison nodded. "And what would you tell someone who's making the same mistake?" Bruno looked directly into the camera. "Tell the truth sooner." Harrison asked softly, "Even when it hurts?" Bruno nodded. "Especially then." A long silence followed. Harrison lowered his voice. "And Jessica?" Bruno looked down for a moment before answering. "I hope she knows I eventually understood." "Understood what?" Bruno smiled faintly. "That she never needed me to be perfect." He paused. "She only needed me to be honest." Harrison's eyes softened. "Do you think you finally are?" Bruno looked at him. "Tonight I tried." Harrison nodded. Neither man spoke for several seconds. The cameras continued recording, but the interview no longer felt like an interview. It felt like two people sitting with something they had finally stopped running from. Harrison eventually asked, "One last sentence, Bruno. If you could erase one thing from that night, what would it be?" Bruno's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "The silence." Harrison waited. Bruno continued quietly, "Because everything I was afraid to say became the thing I regretted most." Harrison nodded. Bruno took one final breath and looked straight ahead. If someone you love is standing in front of you, don't make them guess what you're feeling. Harrison lowered his microphone. That's a powerful place to end. Bruno gave a small smile. Maybe it's where I should have started. The studio fell quiet. Harrison didn't ask another question. Bruno didn't add another explanation. There was nothing left to defend, nothing left to hide, and nothing left to prove. Whatever had happened between Bruno and Jessica belonged to the past. But the lesson Bruno carried from it was painfully simple. Sometimes the hardest truth isn't admitting that you made a mistake. It is admitting that fear made the decision for you. Harrison finally looked toward the camera, then back at Bruno. Thank you for trusting me with this. Bruno nodded. Thank you for asking. The recording light remained on for a few more seconds. Then it switched off. And when Bruno finally stood from his chair, he didn't look like a superstar leaving an interview. He looked like someone who had finally said the words he had been carrying for years. The story was fictional, but the message was real. Love cannot survive on silence forever, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply tell the truth before it's too late. The recording light turned off, but Bruno Mars remained seated for a few seconds, staring at the floor as if he wasn't ready for the moment to end. Harrison Keefe watched him quietly, then asked, "Bruno, are you okay?" Bruno smiled through tired eyes. "Yeah, I think I finally am." Harrison nodded, but before either man could stand, Bruno looked back at him. "There is one thing I wish I'd said differently." Harrison paused. "What?" Bruno took a slow breath. "I kept saying I walked away because I was afraid." He looked toward the camera. "But that's not completely true." Harrison's expression changed. "Then what was the real reason?" Bruno smiled sadly. "I thought I had to become someone else before I could deserve the life I wanted." Harrison remained silent. Bruno continued, "And Jessica was never the person asking me to become someone else." His voice softened. "I was." Harrison lowered his eyes. "So what finally changed?" Bruno answered, "I stopped waiting to become perfect." A quiet pause followed. Then Harrison asked, "If she watched this interview someday, what would you want her to remember?" Bruno looked straight ahead. "That I never forgot what she taught me." Harrison waited. "And what was that?" Bruno smiled faintly. "That being loved isn't something you earn by hiding your broken parts." His eyes became wet again. "Sometimes you just have to let someone see them." Harrison nodded slowly. Neither man spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt complete. Harrison finally stood, but Bruno remained seated for another moment. He looked at the empty chair across from him, took a deep breath, and whispered, "I should have said it sooner." Harrison stopped. "Said what?" Bruno looked up. For a moment he seemed ready to answer. Then he simply smiled. "Thank you." Harrison understood that the interview had reached its real ending. Not with a scandal, not with a shocking accusation. Not with a perfect resolution. But with something far more human. A man finally accepting that the truth he had spent years avoiding was never about losing someone else. It was about learning not to lose himself. And as the studio lights dimmed, one question remained hanging in the air. If Bruno had known then what he knows now, would he have walked away at all?